Good afternoon from Jakarta, and good morning, good evening to everyone joining from other parts of the world. Welcome to the first ever Global Town Hall mini-series on bridging the North-South gap, laying the bricks for just and equitable solutions to the climate crisis. I'm Lian, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's discussions. In addition to the annual flagship event, the Global Town Hall will now convene regular, smaller-scale discussions intended to create a platform for conversations among civil societies. The theme of the discussions will range from geopolitics, climate, food security, AI, technology, and many more. So please do look forward to the upcoming Global Town Hall mini-series. And today, I'm pleased to welcome over 300 participants registered to this discussion. We have attendees from 44 countries, including Afghanistan, Angola, Ghana, Greece, Libya, Lebanon, Indonesia, Malaysia, Rwanda, and many more, making this a real global town hall. And before we proceed to the next agenda, let us start today's discussion with a keynote address from the Honorable Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank global citizens and the foreign policy community of Indonesia for welcoming me and thousands more, hailing from all corners of the globe, for convening this very timely Global Town Hall. As the largest grassroots foreign policy group in Indonesia, the foreign policy community of Indonesia is doing incredibly important work that continues to have immeasurable impact in the global policy space. Similarly, I'm proud to consider global citizens an important ally in helping us speak truth to power as we take action to combat the defining challenges of our generation, the climate crisis, extreme poverty, and global inequality. We captured much of this in the Paris Pact for People and Planet, and of course in the Bridgetown Initiative. We live in a time that the rate of mega disasters, both man-made and natural, now occur with such regularity that offering thoughts and prayers to victims has truly lost its impact. We are, as I've called it, in the season of superlatives. Within the last 4 weeks alone, we've seen a series of natural disasters and catastrophes that truly are nothing short of a continuous nightmare. Last month, we had the Maui wildfires, which caused residents to vacate their homes and literally to jump into the ocean for their safety. A land known for its lushness now charred to a crisp, its vibrance now dulled with a grim blanket of ash. It is now the deadliest such disaster in the United States of America in the last century. Last week, we saw the magnitude 6.8 earthquake in Morocco. It brought buildings, homes, schools crumbling to the ground. And so far, the lives of 2,900 human beings were lost by this single event. And we continue to support the government and people of Morocco during this time. But before we could even properly process what had happened there, catastrophic floods have ravaged Libya, breaching 2 dams and washing homes out to sea. The death toll now stands at over 6,000, and indeed the number of people missing is estimated to be about 10,000. I share these thoughts with you because while Barbados, Hawaii, Morocco, and Libya may literally be worlds apart, we all face existential threats each and every day. 2 years ago, we were talking about the apocalyptic floods in Pakistan. And therefore, my friends, I believe the question posed by today's session can be easily answered in the most succinct of manners. It is simply no. No, we're not all on track. And no, it does not appear that we're all on the same page. Indeed, we are all privy to the same data. We are all witness to the same devastation. We can feel the earth getting hotter. Every summer, the global temperature now reaches new heights. The season of superlatives, as I keep saying. And as the earth therefore continues to warm in large part due to the carbon emissions from our continued overuse of fossil fuels, we will continue to experience hotter and drier summers and regrettably extend the season of superlatives. We will continue to experience less rainfall and increased droughts. And unfortunately, it therefore means that certain climates like Hawaii and many others across the globe will continue to burn. The fact that California can no longer access insurance against wildfires should be a serious wake-up call, not just for those interested in climate, but for all people interested in protecting their homes and their businesses. What has become exceedingly clear is that no corner of the globe will be left untouched by the climate crisis. And yet in many cases, the spirit of urgency continues to elude too many of our leaders. Leaders in the public sector, leaders in the private sector. And that is because, while we all experience the rage of our worsening climate, some of us have the capacity to better weather the proverbial storm and therefore not meet their date with destiny as quickly as others might. And certainly not as catastrophically as others have. But I can tell you, my friends, that that capacity will not last forever. I want to use the Caribbean as an example, as this is, of course, particularly close to home, no pun intended. According to the IMF, since 1951, 511 disasters have hit small states. These states defined as developing economies with populations of less than 1.5 million people. Of these 511 disasters, 324 were in the Caribbean. I want to repeat myself. One of the smallest regions in the world, since 1951, has had 324 of the 511 disasters. That is about 60%. Further, the Caribbean is also 7 times more likely to be hit by natural disasters than larger states, and twice as likely as other small states. Essentially, my region, the Caribbean, despite its less than 0.5% contribution to global fossil fuel emissions, is perfectly positioned to incur the wrath of the climate crisis. And the evidence is there, and therefore I'm not speaking in a speculative manner. And while I'm loath to put a dollar figure on the cost of disasters, and that is because we lose much more than money can buy, it is important to highlight the way the climate crisis cripples the ability of small states to build resilient and robust economies. Let's go to the IMF again. The average estimated disaster damage as a ratio to GDP is 4.5 times greater for small states than it is for large ones. In the Caribbean, it is actually 6 times higher for countries in the Caribbean. So once again, we hit the superlative. And therefore, every time a disaster strikes, our economies take an even greater hit as well. More natural disasters with increased frequency means that we are constantly on our back foot, perpetually in a state of trading debt for devastation over and over and over again. And indeed, you heard me speak about the refusal of insurance companies to offer insurance in California. We are already seeing similar patterns developing in Florida, and it is only a matter of time, regrettably, that I think the Caribbean will be affected. When insurance is denied, how will people get loans? Most banks require security, and most banks require that insurance is a part of the measures of security that are put in place. If we remove this, we are hitting not just at the macroeconomic level, but we are hitting where it hurts most, in communities, among businesses, among families. My friends, it is out of that background that we have developed the Bridgetown Initiative, an admittedly audacious proposal for systemic reform of our international financial institutions, particularly in light of the worsening climate crisis. But this proposal isn't Barbados alone. This proposal has been developed with so many from across the globe and from so many different sectors. Our role has been to give it its advocacy. It recognizes that for small states, the scope of the climate crisis extends beyond natural disasters. In fact, it severely impacts our ability to develop and, my friends, to be. That simple verb, to be. Further, it reimagines our global financial system in such a way that will allow for efficient, inclusive, and resilient financing mechanisms. Financing mechanisms that better respond to today's breadth of global challenges. Simply put, you all know and I know that the world looked a hell of a lot different in 1944. And even if we were not staring in the face of a climate crisis, undoubtedly some other global challenge would have revealed the ineffectiveness of our current financial system, because it simply does not see, feel, or hear too many of our countries across the globe. We claim to live in a post-colonial world, and yet many of our Bretton Woods institutions continue to be rooted in the legacy of colonialism. The shadow is too long. If we truly want to build a strong global economy, one where prosperity touches every corner of the globe, we need first to rid ourselves of an archaic system which only cripples the economies of developing nations. I cannot predict the health of my country by simply looking at our per capita GDP to determine access for concessional loans. Because even if I am upper middle income, lower middle income, low development, the truth is that the climate does not see that. It just sees my vulnerability and the impact on my people, my infrastructure, and my institutions. That is why using per capita income as the sole measurement by international financial institutions and on a historic basis is as relevant as taking my blood pressure from 2 years ago to determine my vulnerability to a stroke or a heart attack. It is absolutely useless. No country should find itself and its citizens drowning in the aftermath of a climate change-induced disaster, and then also find itself drowning in debt, attempting to recover from the said disaster. I'm told that the World Bank is looking for new initiatives now that will allow for us to be able to have, as countries, more immediate access to liquidity after a disaster, such that we meet the immediate needs of our citizens and our country to minimize the other consequences that come if we do not treat to people's needs. We all know that the implosion of national security is perhaps the worst fear of all nation states. My friends, the Bridgetown Initiative proposes a number of things, many of which I won't go into detail now, including pauses on debt payments in the aftermath of the global disaster. And I do hope that the world recognizes that these cannot only be for new debt, but must also include existing debt, because two parties to a contract always have the power to mutually vary the terms and conditions of any contract. Secondly, a global climate mitigation trust to help all across the world to mitigate against the worst aspects of the climate, because mitigation doesn't matter whether it happens in the north, east, west, or south. What matters is that we find the strongest and best projects to be able to help the planet reach that stage where we can avoid a 1.5 degree increase in temperatures, because we see what 1.2 is doing to us. And my friends, the initiative of Bridgetown also speaks to accessing better lending deals, as I just said earlier. And these are just but a few of the initiatives. We don't want in any way to have the rough division that was used on us in a pre-independence period, in a colonial period, be used against us now. And this crass division where we are seeking to put low income against middle income cannot and must not be allowed to work, because low income and middle income countries face the same vulnerability with respect to the decimation of their opportunities and the decimation of the lives of their citizens if they do not get to the point where we can mitigate against the climate and we can adapt to the new realities. Most important, Bridgetown is also about giving countries like mine a sense of stability in the face of an uncertain future. Climate vulnerable nations deserve more from the global community than thoughts and prayers. We require actionable solutions to a very tangible crisis. In my reading on the Maui wildfires, I happened upon a detail that stuck with me. A news report indicated that in the town of Lahaina, there stands a large banyan tree, so large in fact that it takes up the entire block. It has stood proud for around 150 years. And despite now being severely scorched, it continues to stand proud, no doubt a testament to the spirit of the people of Lahaina. My heart goes out to all people who have been affected by these natural disasters and who continue to be month after month in a world that remains stubbornly intransigent to the needs for urgent action and for sufficiently wide action. I know what it is like to have to somehow remain standing even in the aftermath of utter devastation, because more often than not, we are being lurched from crisis to crisis in small states. It might seem minor in the grand scheme of things, but I hope that the beloved banyan tree proves to be as resilient as well as our people had to prove to be during the awful episode of slavery and colonialism. I hope, my friends, that the world does not forget, for there will be undoubtedly another climate disaster next week and next month. Somewhere else will flood, somewhere else will burn. And these appear to be the unfortunate realities of our time in this season of superlatives. As such, we need to create systems and mechanisms that allow the most vulnerable among us to respond, to rebuild, without descending further into debt while doing so. That is and should be our rights as individuals and as countries. I want to thank you again, the foreign policy community of Indonesia and global citizens, for presenting me the opportunity to kick off what I'm sure will be a robust discussion. I regret that I can't be there with you in person, but I hope we can engage and communicate soon, because this world needs all of our efforts going in the same direction if we are to have the speed and the scope that will help save the planet and the people. I wish you the very best. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the remark, Prime Minister. Before we move to the next agenda, I would like to welcome also our audience joining us from our live stream on YouTube. And I encourage everyone to actively share your thoughts and comments and respond to the discussion. And moving on, we regret to inform you that our founder and chairman, Dr. Dinapati Jalal, is unable to moderate the sessions due to unforeseeable circumstances. However, he will instead give a short remark to open this discussion. Dr. Dino, the floor is yours.
Hello, this is Dino Jalal. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to say sorry for not being able to moderate today's discussion. The reason being, I'm on a train to Ukraine, and obviously it's going to be very difficult to moderate under such circumstances. I want to thank all the panels and all the groups that are helping us to organize this very important discussion: World Resources Institute, the Climate Finance Group of Latin America and the Caribbean, Institute for Economy, Energy and Environment of Tsinghua University, and Africa Youth Group Foundation. Thank you so much for joining this panel. This new series, new format of Global Town Hall is quite special because as you know, on 2nd September this year, we held the annual Global Town Hall, and that was quite successful. We had 24,000 participants from 131 countries. We had about 151 civil society groups from 61 countries, and they all discuss a wide range of issues all day long for about 15 hours. A marathon discussion around the clock and around the world. And through this new format of Global Town Hall series, what we are doing is having the same dimension, which is preserving and facilitating room for dialogue between civil societies, East, West, North, South, but in a more routine and periodic way, twice a month, and hopefully it would become even weekly discussions. And our hope is that this discussion will be able to create a room for dialogue for civil societies based on equality and mutual respect. And hopefully that will lead to a process of mutual alignment. We have found out that there are so many groups out there, especially in the Global South, who don't feel they are part of the global conversation. And by having a more routine, more periodic Global Town Hall series, while keeping the East, West, North, South dimension, we hope that we will be able to contribute to a better world through a more intense dialogue from all sides, because we all know that dialogue and consultation is the basis for world peace and cooperation. I wish you all the best in your discussion on climate change, and I look forward to our future cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the remark, Bertino. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us start today's discussions. But before that, I encourage all participants to turn your camera on and also to drop your thoughts and comments in the chat box, both in Zoom and YouTube. And with that, allow me to invite our moderator, Kiara, Program Manager of FPCI Climate Unit. And to Kiara, I hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Flian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Kiara from the FPCI Climate Unit, and I'm very pleased to moderate today's important discussion, Bridging the North-South Gap, laying the bricks for just and equitable solutions to the climate crisis. And ladies and gentlemen, everybody, we only have about 7 years until the Earth's carbon budget is running out in 2030. While at the same time, the world is still, of course, grappling with other complex problems, from armed conflicts around the world, geopolitical tensions, food and water crisis, and many more. And as Prime Minister Motley says in her opening remarks, we are already in the season of superlatives. Right? More and more people, communities, countries all have to deal with the worsening and disastrous impacts of the climate crisis. And yet, with the time window that we have to act already closing in, some concerns on equity from the developing countries and pre-industrialized nations, the global south arose. And from the climate negotiations to the streets, and these concerns, these equity concerns essentially rise from the asymmetry or the gap between countries' emissions and their respective burdens to respond to climate change, notwithstanding as well the differences in capacity, technology, infrastructure of different countries to respond to the climate crisis effectively. And this is also, of course, coupled with the contrast between the past emissions that countries emitted, as well as the future emissions of different nations. So in today's discussion, we're joined by 4 wonderful speakers who will navigate these conversations together. I would like to invite and just say hi to all of the speakers before we begin the discussion. First, I would like to introduce Ambassador Melanie Robinson, the Global Climate Program Director of World Resources Institute. Good morning, Ambassador Melanie, or afternoon.
Good morning. Morning and afternoon. Lovely to see you wherever you are in the world.
Great. Lovely to see you also. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining. And next, I would like to introduce Professor Teng Fei, Professor and Deputy Director of the Institute of Energy, Environment and Economy from Tsinghua University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great to see you. And next, I would like to introduce Sandra Guzman Luna, the founder and general director of Climate Finance Group of Latin America and the Caribbean GFLAG. Welcome,
Hi,
Sandra.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here with all of you.
Thank you for joining. And last but not least, I would like to invite Ernest Iyagi, Program Officer for Migration and Climate Change from Africa Youth Growth Foundation from Nigeria. Hello, Ernest. Okay, but I'm sure that he's already in the room, so we'll also say back. And next, I would just like to now invite, before we actually begin the discussion, I would like to invite all the audience who are present to join in the conversation later on, because we will have an open discussion session as well as Q&A with all of the speakers. So if you would like to raise a question or give comments or interventions, you may use the raise hand feature that we have in the Zoom, or put it down in the chat box if you're joining from YouTube. And now, without further ado, I would like to kick off this discussion with the first question. I would like to direct to Ambassador Melanie Robinson from WRI. So, Ambassador Melanie, now in 1 month, we're going to be approaching COP28, right? So with all of the concerns and the issues that also have been laid out by Prime Minister Motley in her remarks, so I would just want to say what is actually at stake during the next negotiations, and can you give like brief insights on the overview perspective or outlook on what we're dealing with in terms of like the climate action gaps? between the global north and global south. Ambassador Melanie.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I should say it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm sitting here in Kenya with the beautiful Kenyan sunshine coming in and Ethiopian flowers on the wall behind me. So sitting in the middle of many of your time zones. And I'm really grateful to you at the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia for hosting this event and for all those who are participating. But let me turn now to your question. And I think I have three simple messages. The first is that, yes, of course, there are significant challenges. We've heard from Prime Minister Mia Mottley. My second is we mustn't despair. But my third is, yes, we're going to have to redouble efforts. And I want to talk about what we need to do on commitments, rules of the game, and above all, support to turn commitment into action so we can get the deep transformation of sectors and systems we need for a zero carbon, climate resilient and equitable world. So let me start with the challenges. I know already two speakers have spoken about them, but I do want to illustrate further what Prime Minister Mottley said with information from the first ever 5-yearly global stocktake that the UN has done, which is looking at how we're doing in achieving the Paris Agreement goals. And it resoundingly shows us what we already know, which is we are not on track. We are not on track to keep temperature change limited to 1.5. And in fact, with current policies, we're heading more towards 2.5 degrees C warming. We're already witnessing the kind of severe climate impacts on every continent that Prime Minister Mottley talked about, especially in the most vulnerable countries and communities in the global south. And to add to that, we recently heard from the IPCC that some large ecosystems, biodiversity hotspots, regions with food and water insecurity, warm water coral reefs, for example, they're already experiencing extreme and sometimes irreversible climate impacts. So we're starting to hear about some of those tipping points. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on this because other speakers have already touched on them, but because I move on quickly, it's not because we mustn't dwell very hard on the situation that we're in going into COP28. I do want to say, though, because I think it's important to encourage us that we mustn't despair. We have made progress in recent years. We now have more than 75% of the global economy covered by net zero emission targets. At least 84% of countries have adaptation plans and strategies that they're converting into laws and policies. Even if clean energy and electric vehicles need to grow up more than 5 times faster than they already are, we are seeing those galloping leaps in renewable energy, especially solar, and exponential growth in electric vehicles, which suggests we can also reach positive tipping points. It's something WRI's System Change Lab is looking at. What are those positive tipping points? And on adaptation, as a development practitioner for the last 25 years, I've seen on the ground in developing countries the incredible work that's been done on locally led approaches to disaster risk management, climate resilient agriculture, water, and more. So although we are far, far from where we need to be, we should also take comfort that we have some of the tools and systems and we can make progress when we really want to. But then my third point is to say, clearly, we need to redouble and more than redouble efforts. And I want to talk about 3 levels of that. The first is clearly the commitment level, and that's what the UNFCCC is so good at. We do have many major economies not yet carrying their weight on reducing emissions. And we're going to be looking for more commitment from them now and in the years to come. We do want to see, as Prime Minister Mottley said, more of the private sector making climate resilient, inclusive net zero commitments. And perhaps most importantly, for now, developed countries need to hit that 100 billion finance commitment this year. I was at the COP in Copenhagen when that commitment was made, and it is not right, it wasn't hit on time. It must be hit this year. And then next year, we'll need to agree a new finance goal for post-2025, which is essential for the trillions needed for implementation. And frankly, it's essential for North-South trust in this whole process. The second area where we need to redouble effort is maybe a bit more technical, but it's about the rules of the game, the systems, the governance, so that we can properly incorporate climate into our decisions and into our economies. Now, WRI has a proud history here of helping define these. We've helped set science-based targets, account for emissions, we've helped in the design of a functioning carbon market. All these need to be expanded and improved. And as Prime Minister Mottley said, we need a reformed international financial system that can deliver those trillions, much of it leveraged by private finance, but with a high need for public finance too. The Bridgetown Agenda has set out a really great agenda for this. Conversations are taking place in Marrakesh almost as we speak, and we need to keep moving on that. We can come back to this more, but as a previous member of the board of the World Bank, I can't help diving in a little bit like Prime Minister Motley, I want the system to be more effective, accessible, and responsive. We need to reform the current system. It's disjointed, bureaucratic, siloed, and it fails to recognize what actually is true on the ground, which is development, climate, and nature need to come together and be integrated, and that we need more simplified access. We can make finance more efficient and effective, stretching money further. I'm happy to go into in future how we assign that precious public concessional finance so that it's really reaching those who need it. We can stretch MDB balance sheets. The G20's got recommendations on that. We can redeploy special drawing rights. We can take account of climate risk in debt agreements, as the British Town Agenda says. But we also need to generate more long-term patient finance, including through, for example, conditional IFI capital increases, domestic resource mobilization, and innovative mechanisms like maritime tax or luxury consumption taxes, leveraging and de-risking private finance. Let me finish by just saying to your question about the gaps. Yes, there are gaps in commitments, but one of the biggest gaps that we feel as WRI all over the world is the gap about implementation. We can have all the best commitments in the world, but if they are not implemented, we're not going to be able to drive forward that transformation that we need to be able to avoid these climate impacts that Prime Minister Motley has talked about. And in WRI's new five-year plan, we're focusing much more on supporting countries in those transitions, in defining those transitions, but more importantly, financing and implementing those, something we've been doing in Indonesia in recent years. So this is about supporting integrated national and subnational planning, bringing together development, climate, environment, about helping countries have clear visions for a pathway forward for low carbon, climate resilient, nature positive, inclusive growth, building those better, more sustainable economies and societies, supporting countries to translate that into legislation, policies and regulations, shifting the incentives for the private sector and citizens, taking account of the political economy, and really including local community voices in that decision making. This does need to cascade into sector plans in the most important areas. And in WRI, we're really focusing on supporting countries and South-South learning on energy, cities, forest, land, and water, and then those transitions in particular. And again, so important that local communities, especially those who are marginalized and have something to lose, are involved in that decision-making. It's essential these are just and inclusive transitions and that we have locally led adaptation. And finally, to close that gap, we need the finance to get onto the ground. This will always be about combining domestic and international public and private finance to come in behind these new pathways. And that money needs to be directed to the local level, especially when it comes to adaptation and loss and damage. But we have to get to the stage where we're not only doubling down on more significant commitments and making the systems work, but we're really getting implementation on the ground. So we can tackle this climate crisis and build confidence that we can move forward together. I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Melanie. That is a very much insightful answer, and I think we can dig a lot of things and delve into those specific things a little bit later on. And now I would like to refer to Sandra. And I think from Ambassador Melanie's answer, she mentioned a lot about, the gaps is in the capital implementation, right? And then I think when we're talking about the gap between the developing and developed nations and climate, two things that are very apparent is the first one, of course, about the money, the financing. And then the second one is on the capacity, infrastructure, and technology, perhaps under the overarching themes of means of implementation. And so I would like to ask you, Sandra, you yourself and your organization had ample involvements, especially, on the global climate finance, and how to figure out what kind of structures or schemes that can better accommodate developing nations, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so can you perhaps elaborate more, on the existing gaps, perhaps on the climate financing side, and, what are your ideas or initiatives on what you see regarding how can we enhance global finance mechanisms or structure, and what's the prospect of those emerging initiatives mentioned also by Ambassador Melanie and Prime Minister Mia Motley?
Thank you so much, Chiara, and thanks a lot again for the opportunity to be here. Please allow me to start this reflection saying that during the last 16 years, I have been following and being close of the climate negotiations, trying to understand not only where the countries are coming from, but how could we create synergies to tackle this big issue that we face. And of course, I have been listening the perspectives from developed countries and the perspectives from developing countries, and it's clear that both sides have concerns. Both of them are valid in their own respective context. And one of the critical elements is that in this climate discussion, context matters. It is true that we are facing a historical problem, because it is true that interventions in the past have caused fractures and mistrust among countries. And this has been creating gaps and inequalities that today are like hindering our possibilities to tackle the problem in the same way. But it is true that since then, we have been mainly focusing in what are the points, or what are the key differences that exist across countries. And I think that we have the opportunity now to rethink a little bit the approach, and not only thinking those elements that differentiate us, but also those elements that create synergies and that put us, that are common denominators across all of us, because this is a matter of a humanity problem. And of course, this is very important to consider it based on the principle of common but differentiating capacities and responsibilities, because it is true that not all of us have been contributing in the same way to the problem. And it is true that all the countries want to do something, but we don't necessarily have the same means and the same context to be able to tackle in the same considerations or in the same way. So I would like to emphasize three important gaps that we have so far, and that for developing countries are extremely important, but not only for developing countries, but also should be important for developed countries. So the very first gap that we have, and the Prime Minister mentioned this, is the problem of eradication of poverty. And it is important to say that there is not only poverty in the global south, there are also a growing number of people living in poor conditions in the global north as well. A lot of people that don't have houses because on the unpayable cost of living in certain countries in the US, in Europe, and others. This means that it's not only a problem of the global and south vision, but it's the way that our societies are structured. In the global south, we also have rich people that don't pay taxes, and therefore they are also part of the problem. So what I'm trying to say here is that the reduction of that poverty gap is a matter that we both develop and developing countries have to tackle, because it's the very first element that is important to reduce those like deep problems that we are facing when we talk about other agendas. And the second agenda is precisely the destruction of nature. There is no one single country that will survive without nature. Companies are doing a lot of are creating a lot of problems because the extractive activities are destructing the nature. But it is important to say that every single country will need, like if you are in the US, you will need to protect the Amazon in Brazil and in Ecuador and Colombia, because every single spot in terms of nature will be very relevant to create that balance across all the countries. And this is also important to mention, because sometimes when we talk about the destruction of biodiversity, we believe that, well, that will affect Australia, but it's not going to affect me. And this is precisely why we have to start thinking in a more systematic and a more systemic way, and think that whatever happens in Antarctica, for instance, with the melting of glaciers, will affect Mexico, will affect every single part. And that's why we have to then tackle the second gap, that is the protection of nature. Doesn't matter where we are, doesn't matter what is the country, we have to protect nature because it's part of what connects us. And the third gap, of course, is the climate gap. And when I'm referring to gap, I'm not only referring to financial gap, but it's also capacity gap. It's also like understanding gap, because we are not necessarily understanding how all these problems are interconnected. So when we talk about climate change, we are also thinking sometimes that it's going to affect only the most vulnerable countries. Of course, it's going to affect the most vulnerable countries, but climate change is happening all around the world. And we faced a few weeks ago these big problems with in New York with these floods, and we are seeing droughts in France and in many other places. So when we talk about climate change, it's also about how these climate impacts will intensify then poverty, how these climate impacts will intensify the destruction of nature, and how all these agendas have to be interconnected. We have been tackling these problems in silos. For instance, we have a convention on biodiversity, we have a convention on climate finance, on climate change. But when we talk about the real action in the ground, it's very difficult to separate what is important, biodiversity from climate change, or even for poverty. And this is why I truly believe that what we need is to create better synergies across policies, regulations, and of course, the allocation of finance, because it is not possible to say, okay, we are going to give more climate finance, but we are going to reduce finance for development, or we are going to give more finance for the biodiversity and reduce climate finance. This is precisely a problem that we are facing. We are identifying more and more discussions that are creating problems across the agendas. So what I would like to emphasize in this point is that it is true that developed countries have debts with developing countries. And paying these debts is not only a benefit for the global south, but if we, for instance, reduce or cancel or create swaps in terms of the debts to, for instance, invest in nature, invest in loss and damage, invest in adaptation, will be important not only for the global south, but also for the global north. Why? Because those populations that are suffering the impacts of climate change are starting to mobilize and will increase. We are going to see more migrations across the world, and this will create also other social problems and violence, wars, and other problems that we are identifying across the globe. So climate change will intensify the levels of violence that we are seeing around the world, and that's why it is important to consider all these issues, not only environmental issues, but also security issues, and therefore we have to tackle them in a more effective and in this synergy. And finally, in this intervention, I would like just to say that it is very, very important to consider that the developed in developing countries has been, thanks to the developing world as well. And it is our great opportunity to create more synergies, because the protection of nature, increasing our capacity to adapt to climate change, will be a survival matter for every single like country. And that's why the financial institutions and all the political system has to embrace these synergies across all the agendas to really transform the way that we are operating. The financial institutions so far are not able to understand the synergies between biodiversity and climate change. And that's why, as my colleague was saying, we have to transform from the deep core. And that's why the reform that is happening now and the discussions that are happening in Morocco are so important, but as well as to connect them with the discussions that are going to happen in COP28. And I would like to talk about that in a few minutes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Sandra, and for your very insightful answer. We can go back with that later on, but now I would like to continue the discussion with the next speaker, Professor Teng Fei. I would like to invite you to also give your insights, perhaps more on your point of view, as you have a deep understanding about the strategies of in decarbonizations as well as adaptation of China, which we all know is one of the largest emitters in the world right now. And what I think is interesting is that last year at COP27, right, countries reached a breakthrough agreement to establish the Loss and Damage Fund facility. And we know that China is one of the countries supporting the G77 to also establish this. So I think what I would like to explore with you is how does China actually position itself in kind of these climate conversations? Does it see itself as more developing nations that can, receive aids and kind of assistance in responding to climate, or do you think that it will act more as a leader or more as a developed nation with its big economy that can really assist other developing and climate vulnerable countries. Can you perhaps give your take on this?
Thank you so much for having me here. And regarding to your question, I think China is a developing country in terms of almost a lot of indicators, as you may see, for example, the per capita income and other very important indicators. For any of them, that China is definitely a developing countries. But in terms of this climate issues, I think firstly that China is a member of developing countries. And as a group of the developing countries, we all know that this group of countries suffered unproportional from the negative impact of climate change. We already know this very clearly from the intervention of previous speakers, and especially the Prime Minister of Barbados mentioned this very clearly in terms of, for example, several numbers that although the developing country accounts for almost 80% of the global population, but in terms of the cumulative emission or the total emission has emitted since the 1950s, which is the starting of the industrial revolution, that developing countries only accounts for about 20% of the total cumulative emissions. So the developing countries as a whole is only a minor part of that problem, but developing countries suffers most, as we all know that in terms of this global climate damage, that developing countries suffered almost more than 80% of the global damage, and it will suffer more in the future. So that is basic position that why China support that to establish this loss and damage fund that to support developing countries to cope with climate change, especially in terms of those damage and adaptation. And in addition to that, I think that China also are that supporting developing countries through the form of source cooperation, that China consider itself as a part of developing countries, and also has the obligation that to help developing countries through this source cooperation that to achieve accelerated transition within the context of sustainable development. That is the major challenge that developing countries are facing, because of developing countries are not only need to deal with climate change, but also need to develop our economy and also that make our citizens more rich. I think that is the basic challenge that developing countries are facing. And the most challenging issues is we only have very limited resource that to deal with those multiple challenge at the same time. So we need to consider how to achieve this within this very limited resource. Of course, we need a large amount of money transfer from rich countries to developing countries, because they bear this moral responsibility. They are the major emitters in terms of the cumulative emission. So they have the responsibility to fix this through transfer the resource from north to the south. But at the same time, that developing countries also need to improve the efficiency of our limited resource. I think this can be done through many ways, but one of the most important instrument is the source cooperation. The reason because of firstly, developing countries, we shared the similar experience and challenge because of, for example, China has the similar experience and challenge with many other developing countries. So in terms of that, the solution developed by China or other emerging economies could be much more easily adapted that in other developing countries. And second one is those solutions and technology developed by emerging developing countries often tend to be more cheap compared with those more advanced but more expensive technology from the north. So that will be very helpful that for developing countries to maximize the effectiveness of their limited resources. And also the global source cooperation has an equal partnership that they treat each other in a more equal way and less power disparity compared with North-South interaction. So that will make the cooperation much more easier. And also, of course, we need to work with other North-South cooperation to maximize the effectiveness and efficiency and to synergy with those North-South cooperation, and also that to build, for example, the three-party or triangular cooperation. But it should be noted that those South-South cooperation is not a responsibility for developing countries. I think that is major difference in nature with those North-South resource transfer, which has been considered as a commitment in terms of the Paris Agreement and other agreement. So I think that should be clear. So to summarize, I think that developing countries need to intensify the cooperation in the future and to improve the efficiency of our limited resources to cope with this multinational, multidimensional challenge that we are facing. But at the same time, that to further expand this support from developed countries to developing countries is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Teng Fei. You touch upon the idea of South-South cooperation. I think we can visit that later on. Now, I would like to direct to Ernest from the Africa Youth Growth Foundation. So Ernest, I think from the previous discussions as well as answers from the other speakers, we talked about disparities in capacities, be it in technology, financial, and any perhaps also as well as some common denominators or elements of commons that all of us actually have, right? Now, I would like to touch upon on the fact that, you know, very real crisis damages are already undergoing and is being faced by a lot of communities, especially in Africa. We know that it's one of the most climate vulnerable regions. And so please could you tell us, you know, what is the situation and reality in Africa on the ground right now? And, you know, what do you think are the existing gaps that are very apparent and that needs to be highlighted, especially in the African region case?
All right, thank you very much. For Africa, the situation is not friendly. Our people are suffering. As I speak, we are experiencing disastrous floods ravaging most communities in Africa and countries particularly. We are also experiencing devastating earthquakes, particularly in Morocco. Wildfire in Algeria. These are pathetic situations. We are experiencing, as I speak, severe flooding, even in Democratic Republic of Congo and also in Rwanda. We have also experienced that in Nigeria particularly, and flooding also in Libya. If this continues to happen, humanity will face a whole lot of challenges in Africa, and there is every need to mitigate against all of these things. Then speaking about the gaps, or talking about the gaps that we have seen that are very obvious as far as Africa is concerned in this climate crisis, there we have gaps in funding, the northern domination of funding relevant to climate change policy, and the overbearing limitation in funding for southern NGOs and development bodies and CSO may hinder the implementation of the Global Climate Change Agreement. We also have gaps in developmental disciplines, such as environmental sciences, that are so much in need of capacity and funding. Trust me, this is operational in the global north, and there is a need also to have this focus in some areas in Africa. We have gaps in research. Evidence has it that most of the researches on climate crisis or climate change crisis and environmental vulnerabilities are initiated in the north. Why not having all of this process decentralized also, so that some countries in the global south can also participate actively in the processes of bringing out the outcome of some of this research? We also have some obvious facts that in most of the states, or most of the states that makes up the South, are not yet industrialized. And this is a gap for us in Africa. There is a gap also in economic capacity. It is obvious, as the economic realities in North seems very, very advanced as against what it is in the global South. So for us in Africa, we see this as a gap, and it is a gap that needed a quick closure. There is gap also in science and technology. This gap is so widened in such a way that most of the developmental strides in science and technology are developed or concentrated in the global North, whereas the global South, and Africa to be precise, is left to wallow in all of this backwardness. And this is a gap that needs to be filled. Then we have gap also in advocacy. Most of the communities in the South and Africa to be particular lacks the requisite information about climate change and environment and the role they play in mitigating its consequences. It is very important also to carry this advocacy to the grassroots, to let our people in our local communities know about the consequences of climate change and the crisis that the world is exposed to, and Africa to be particular. So we need this gap as far as advocacy is concerned to be filled and bridged very quickly. So as we advocate from AYGF, we have also experienced also that we have gaps in capacity. The general capacity building of stakeholders is very low in Africa. Most of the CSOs and developmental bodies lack the capacities to deal with some of these issues. Then we advocate that this gap in this area of capacity be closed as quick as possible. If we don't do all of these things, I tell you, humanity in Africa is exposed to a bigger danger. And finally, in the area of gaps, we have gaps in building mitigation. We have gaps in building resilience, and we have gaps in building adaptation. Resilience, mitigation, and adaptation is everywhere in every literature that has to do with climate crisis and environmental issues. But these issues, or most of these preferred solutions, are lacking in our continent of Africa. How do you build mitigation of people who are frustrated? How do you build resilience in a community of people who are ravaged with disaster? How do you build adaptation in a community of people who have nothing or have no hope at all to build their living wage on? So there is every need to identify some of those gaps, and there is need to begin to build structures to have all of them covered. We also have gaps too in information. The gap in information is so big or so wide in such a way that the information that is available to the global North is lacking in the global South. And we advocate here that the reality of the provisions of information for most of the developmental bodies or NGOs or stakeholders of climate change and environmental crisis in the global North should also be decentralized to ensure that the countries in Africa and particularly in the global South have access to some of this information too, because information is key in this fight against global crisis that has to do with climate change and environmental issues. So we are very passionate about these gaps, and until these gaps are closed, until we have mitigated against these gaps, that Africa will breathe forth a breath of life, that Africa will begin to see the light of the developmental strides as far as the fight against climate crisis is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernest, for your answer. I think that really gives us a lot of very much observation, a wide range of observation from your region. And you mentioned a lot on the gaps on capacity. And I see that there's a comment from Anthony saying that even to fund researches is a big issue, and especially in Nigeria, said that driving policies effectively, and some of the policies need to be repealed and reenacted so that it could have adequate to tackle climate changes at hand. So I think
Exactly.
thank you very much, for your intervention on that. And so I would like to now kind of move and link our discussion to the very important COP that is upcoming next month. As we know that the upcoming COP is dubbed as a course correction, right, by everyone, with the first global stocktake report already released. And now I want to touch upon, the dimension of international climate cooperation along this topic. we know that international climate cooperation doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? And we have seen and witnessed geopolitical tensions in many parts of the world, perhaps including US, China, the two largest emitting countries, as well as we witness ongoing armed conflicts like the one ongoing in Ukraine and now the Gaza Strip, and of course, climate impacts that are worsening this year alone. And so perhaps I want to direct this question to all of the speakers to kind of move to the discussion around what's at stake at the upcoming COP. And starting with Ambassador Melanie, this is just like trying to put things in a simpler understanding, I would say. So what's the push and the pull in the situation, like seeing all these gaps, the challenges, and some elements that are perhaps the common denominators for all of us? Do we need perhaps mitigation or adaptation more? And how do the existing problems that I mentioned, of course, like the ongoing armed conflicts, will that take the political leaders' attention away from the upcoming COP and how actually important it is? And will we see perhaps a decrease or very incremental progress in commitments? I would like to delve deeper on that.
Well, thank you, Kiara. And, it was really a pleasure for me to hear the other speakers today as well. Starting with your point about the current geopolitics, of course, it is a concern. It absolutely is a concern that political leaders only have a certain amount of bandwidth, if you like. And when their focus and attention is understandably on some of these other crises in our world at the moment and the tragic consequences, then that is a challenge. It also provides a challenge for structural finance. There's only so much ODA in the world, and clearly some of that has had to go to support Ukraine. Who knows what will come of the conflict in the Middle East. And I do think the geopolitical context does challenge us in terms of multilateralism. And when you have these challenging geopolitical environments, it is hard to come together. But I'm always an optimist and looking for the upside. And I have to say that, so many people have commented, and they're right, that the Ukraine war has taught people a lot about energy security, and in the medium term does look like it's going to accelerate the transition to renewable energy. So although you can never have a silver lining to the invasion of a country, this at least is something that's accelerating a positive trend. And I would say around the geopolitics, that actually maybe climate is the one area where we can say, we all need to live together on a livable planet. This is one area where we have to cooperate. We need to cooperate. We want to cooperate. So I do hope that it's one of the bridges that we find north, south, east, west to find ways to cooperate. That's my sincere hope. Now, turning to what's actually going to happen at the COP. Now, as I say, we've had this global stocktake. That's every 5 years. So it should be a wake-up call to where we stand. And that put together with the most amazing impassioned pleas that we're hearing from people like Prime Minister Motley, I hope will get people to pay attention. The stocktake will culminate at COP28. And so it is an opportunity to spur the kind of transformational change that we need across all the elements you said. We need to spur action across emissions, adaptation, finance, and loss and damage. So I'm hoping to see that kind of very specifically, if we look at the agenda items likely to come up in Dubai, fossil fuels will be most central. They are at the heart of our climate crisis, and we do need commitments by countries to shift rapidly and equitably away from fossil fuels. And clearly this needs to be paired with other actions to keep the world on track for 1.5 degrees centigrade, such as tripling renewable energy capacity, doubling the share of fossil-free transport, and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. So I expect that to be one of the key areas for debate and action. I also think perhaps outside of the negotiations, but that this COP will see a lot of focus on food systems and agriculture, including taking action on the way that unsustainable agriculture can impinge on forests and other ecosystems. Then I do think adaptation will be a critical issue, and we need to maintain a strong focus on tackling the severe climate impacts the world's facing. So whilst it's more at the esoteric level, I think the adoption of a framework and process to set indicators for the global goal and adaptation will be important. And then clearly lots of eyes are on building on the agreement on loss and damage at last year's COP. So the aspiration is to operationalize the loss and damage fund so it can start receiving funds and dispersing them to hard-hit communities. And I personally hope we'll find a way for rich countries to take responsibility for past emissions by providing funding, but recognizing that, as I said before, this ODA won't necessarily increase the overall pot. We'll also need to look at contributions and innovative mechanisms from today's polluters. Finance will be key. We'll need clarity on reaching the 100 billion goal and progress towards doubling adaptation finance. And the negotiations will want to show headway on how to align all financial flows with Paris goals, including how private finance can shift to Paris alignment and how debt issues raised by Prime Minister Motley and Sandra Guzman, how they can be addressed to make it more possible for developing countries to pursue adaptation and emission reductions. Lastly, we will want strong signals from the COP about the next round of national commitments, or NDCs as they're known under the Paris Agreement, which are due by early 2025, which actually, given capacity constraints that we've heard from some of the speakers, is only just around the corner. And when they are put forward, these commitments should demonstrate not only stronger ambition, but also signal the concrete actions and targets countries will pursue in specific sectors. So as with all COPs, COP28 needs to serve as a catalyst so all countries strengthen their climate action, along with the finance needed to make that action possible. We have little time to lose. So this COP is essential to mobilize the kind of collective effort of the world that you are also trying to help us build here in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Melanie. You have given a very complete outlook on the upcoming COP28, and you also mentioned a lot on specific sectors, but you also mentioned about, one of the highlights in the COP28 perhaps is going to be on fossil fuels, the eyes on fossil fuels. And so I would like to also move the discussion to Sandra. Same question, what do you think is at stake at COP28, but also kind of focusing rather on like how can we ensure, how can the global South countries ensure that we can transition away, for example, from fossil fuels and be able to cushion the impacts of that transition. Because as I perhaps also talked to you earlier about some developing countries, perhaps, for example, in Indonesia, we are very much reliant on fossil fuels, right? And, transitioning, there will be consequences, there will be people losing their jobs and etc. So what do you think are the way forward? How can we cushion these impacts? And do you think that it will be a focus also on COP28?
Thank you so much, Chiara. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the critical challenges is precisely decouple our economies and our societies from extractive activities, as you were mentioning. For instance, in the case of Latin America, the income that comes from fossil fuel industries is 10 times higher than the income that we have from sustainable finance, for instance. In that sense, there is a massive incentive to keep producing fossil fuels, to keep promoting mining activities, because it's a big revenue source. In that sense, I think it is very, very important to start thinking a little bit outside of the box and start thinking in financial mechanisms that will help us. For instance, in Latin America, we have some of the most mega biodiverse countries in the world. And how can we create more financial mechanisms to create jobs to protect nature? Instead of incentivizing those activities that are destroying nature, why not create jobs to increase the protection and conservation of nature as part of our economies? And in this case, we need to create new industries. We need to create new type of jobs, new type of schemes where capacity building technology has to be developed, and not only technology transfer, for how can we as developing countries can start creating our own technologies. And I would like to emphasize this point that Dr. mentioned about the South-South cooperation, because we have similar realities that can help us to share those experiences. And of course, fully agreed in the sense that for sure, international financial support is critical. And that has to happen because it's part of the commitments. But it's also very relevant to talk about how, as developing countries, we can make more efficient the use of our public expenditure to ensure that all these investments and incentives are also in place. So in this context, I would like to emphasize a few points about what is very important to at least it would be important to see in COP28. The very first point, and I agree with the ambassador, is precisely the fulfillment of the commitment that was established in 2009 about the transfer of these $100 billion per year that unfortunately we haven't seen in terms of the actual financial mobilization. We know that 100 billion is not enough. Like just based in the reports of the Standing Committee on Finance, we are talking only like based on the NDCs that have been costed, that we need around 5.8 trillion towards 2030. This is more or less 580 billion per year, almost 6 times more than the 100 billion. And this is an underestimation, I have to say, because not all the developing countries have been able to estimate, for instance, what's the cost of the NDCs, what's the cost of the national adaptation plans. And it's part of the challenges that we still have, no? Like, because as you know, costing adaptation mechanisms and actions is not easy, no? It's not easy, but it's part of the challenges that we have. But also we have another very important challenge, and it's precisely we are in the discussion to design a new collective and quantified goal on climate finance that has to be designed by next year. We have been celebrating 7 technical expert dialogues on this matter. But what is really relevant of this goal and what is relevant for all of us here in this conversation is that this goal, differently from the 100 billion goal, has to be designed taking into account the needs of developing countries. So it is very important that this goal has to consider where are the needs, what are the needs. And for instance, it is important to highlight that adaptation finance is a massive need in developing countries and loss and damage as well. So this goal has to consider this as well as the balance in terms of how much goes to mitigation, how much goes to adaptation. The third point is precisely about the loss and damage fund. And it is very important to mention that this fund has to be fair, has to be innovative. It has to be additional to other funds. And in this context, it's really, really relevant that one of the characteristics of this fund is access. Access is the biggest issue when we talk about climate finance. Not all the countries are accessing in the same way. And if the loss and damage doesn't have this conversation about good access and balancing access, will fail. And the final point that I wanted to emphasize in relation to the COP28 is precisely that we have the opportunity to not only increase climate finance flows, but also we have to start talking deeply about how we are going to reduce incentives for extractive and high carbon activities. For instance, the reduction of subsidies. The reduction of subsidies is already in the decision text in COP26 and COP27, but now we have to materialize the reduction of subsidies, reduction of incentives on fossil fuel industries, and this has to happen all across the world, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries, because those companies, those that are causing the damages are the ones that have the biggest support and incentives so far. So we have to start tackling and operationalizing those through regulation policies and other mechanisms. And all this is to achieve the Article 21C of the Paris Agreement that says that all financial flows should be consistent with a low greenhouse gases development and a climate resilient development as well. So that's the task, and we have to work quickly towards that scenario. Thank you, Kiara.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And now I would like to revert to Professor Ting-Fei. Can you give us your perspective on the upcoming COP28 and what role will China take? Because if I'm not mistaken, I read an article on Xinhua News a few days ago, saying that the president designate of COP28 say that China will take a key role in the next COP28. I think I would like to just delve deeper on that, and what is kind of your perspective on that? What do you think are perhaps the breakthroughs or emerging initiatives that China will supposedly support on the upcoming COP28?
Well, yeah, thank you. I think firstly, from my perspective, I think that the COP28 should contribute that to improve the implementation as the first priority, because as we all know that although there are several gaps in terms of ambition, in terms of the implementation, in terms of the means of implementation, but from my perspective or from China's perspective, the first priority is to close the gap of implementation and also the means of implementation, because only with this we can build the confidence and trust among ourselves that to move the process forwards. For example, one of the most gap we see is the finance gap, as previous speakers correctly mentioned that although the $100 billion commitment has been made, in fact, about 14 years ago in Copenhagen and reiterated in Paris, but still there is not so much progress, and also there's no progress in terms of the financial commitment after 2020, I mean 2025 or 2030. That hurt the trust and confidence in the negotiation very much, because of in the Paris Agreement, the basic logic or the compromise is developing countries move forwards towards with ambitions, commitment, and developed countries provide support. But we can see that developing countries already made very ambitious commitment, but there is no fulfillment of this financial commitment. So basically, that is how the process fails to make progress at this moment, and almost has the risk of failure. So I believe that if we want to break this deadlock, we need to see that developed countries fulfill their commitment first, and then I think that will help we achieve ambitious outcome in the COP28 and also in the future. And also I see that it is important that to have a better implementation of the global carbon market. We see that is a very important instrument that to transfer the necessary resource from the north to the south, and also that to use the market instrument that to achieve the least cost mitigation at global level. Because we see that right now, most of the NDCs will be implemented by countries individually, but not collectively. But with this global carbon market, we can bring every country together and to achieve more ambitious goals with a fewer cost. And that will help us also close this ambition gap and also the implementation gap. But we are very concerned about the slow progress of this global carbon market. So I see that maybe in the future that that is one of the very key areas that we should move forward. And also know that China right now that are working very hard in terms of this domestic carbon market. So China also has a willingness that to through the South cooperation that help other developing countries and to consider the development of their own market instruments through this kind of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now I would like to invite Ernest to also give his insights on the question for the second round.
All right, thank you very much. From the African Youth Growth Foundation, we advocate and propose that if the COP28 must be defined successful, the following solutions provided by the AYGF should be looked into. We advocate that funding should be made available to local stakeholders who understand the local context. This is because research that emanates from the Global South is in the best place to solve local climate problems. As such, we invest in local research from the Global South, or investment in local research from Global South will be a way out. Furthermore, policies that affect global issues, irrespective of where the funding is coming from, should have both the North and the South at the table to make these policy decisions, because the output of such a policy will be considered not biased. From the available evidence, most of the policy instruments developed under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are generated in the North, and it is northern countries that have set the global climate change policy agenda since the beginning. This culture should be discontinued. The Paris Agreement suggested a new bottom-to-top approach to enable countries to provide their own contributions. However, the northern domination of climate financing, climate policy, and resources without recourse to the South, and Africa to be particular, has considerable negative consequences on the implementation of the bottom-to-top global agreement. We at AYGF advocate that practical steps should be taken in order to ensure a quick shift from a northern-dominated funding, a northern-dominated development, a northern-dominated research culture that puts a closure to the gap and to adopt the one that supports equitable and just involvement of certain stakeholders. We also advocate that the gap in capacity be closed by providing a level playing ground for capacity building of both stakeholders from the South and the North. In clear terms, it has been argued that northern countries are the main suppliers of knowledge and funding necessary to deal with this climate crisis because they are most stable and richer, and the story shouldn't be so. For us at AYGF, we advocate, therefore, that climate change clubs should be established in our high level of secondary schools and ensure enrollment and more researches to be carried out by these youngsters in order to deal with climate issues from the root. For Africa, our wealth may not guarantee a good fight against the climate crisis, and therefore, we advocate a just and inclusive climate governance and ensure that chances of securing funding should be both ways, north and south. There is also the need for us to have knowledge exchange between the north and the south within the context of mutual respect, which we consider to be very key. This situation may be detrimental when northern stakeholders rarely even visit the southern countries or place undue processes in granting them visas. This should be discontinued, and we advocate against this. All of these issues should be discussed at the COP28. We advocate for more funding for academic institutions in those certain countries that are champions of climate change researches. Because if we invest in all of these people, trust me, a more holistic research will come out of it. We advocate that local institutions and stakeholders should be involved to enhance the efficacy and legitimacy of assessment of climate change vulnerabilities and impact. Because they are on ground, they are seeing the situation, they are seeing the problem, and they know exactly where it hurts them. We also advocate that intergovernmental organizations, international donor organizations, and northern governmental institutions should be more effective into encouraging north-south approaches that are result-oriented. We should also try as much as possible to encourage scholarship and scholars from the South, and particularly in Africa also, to carry out researches in their own local areas in order to prefer more qualitative solutions to climate issues, because they are on ground and they understand the common language of the local context. There should be financial support to stakeholder organizations in the South to be able to deal with the financial issue in order to tackle climate change projects by removing the cumbersome procedures in accessing funds for local NGOs. You can see it for yourself. In most situations, when local NGOs and developmental bodies in the South are looking or probably sourcing for funding, the processes involved in granting these funds tend to be very discouraging and cumbersome. And it is not so for countries in the global North. We are saying and advocating that all of these processes should be streamlined in such a way that there is a level playing ground of fit for everybody to access funds to deal with climate issues as it affects us. We already have a climate-induced, or we already have climate-induced migration and climate-induced insecurity, which is poorly reported. We then advocate that journalists from the South should be encouraged with funding and also capacity building to make this aspect of reporting very, very serious. We must be intentional in building alliances with both northern and southern stakeholders to share a common infrastructure and to strengthen local capacity to carry out more result-oriented projects. This will build networks of north-south collaborations. At the same time, we are advocating for policy change that brings climate crisis and environmental issues into colleges and vocational school curriculum, where intending oil professionals will see good prospects in renewable energy and innovation. We must work again to break the political supremacy in the North purported to be to probably be supposed solution to our problem, which is overly not true. Just as efforts are being made to build adaptation in the north for communities threatened by climate change crisis, we also have communities in Africa who are ravaged by disasters caused by climate change and climate crisis, specifically in the Niger Delta area of Nigeria and some of the other countries that I have mentioned earlier at the introductory part of this conversation, and so many other parts of Africa, with even more life-threatening climate consequences. So there is need, therefore, for support to ensure a just and equitable climate solution that is solution for all. We advocate from our part as AYGS, speaking on behalf of the African people, of deliberation between the North and the South in order to foster a better climate solution. We advocate that international communities like the United Nations and the World Bank should have the sympathy and appreciate the little effort that Africa people or countries in the global South are making, most especially the poorer nations who are ravaged by some of these disasters. A better platform of information sharing should be encouraged to build capacities for modern techniques that are operational also in the global North. Finally, the youth in the global South should also have the platform of interaction with their counterparts in the global North. With this, there is a platform to share, to learn, and even unlearn for better climate solutions. If all of these solutions are put into consideration in this COP28, these are some of the positive outcomes. There will be a certain contribution to the development of global climate policies and climate solutions. The South country or the Southern countries would also have contributed to the scientific solutions around greenhouse gas emissions. There will be capacity to deal with emerging climate challenges, and a better approach to building resilience, mitigation, and adaptation would have been employed. It will ensure universal acceptability of the global climate change policy agenda. Finally, from AYGF, African Youth Growth Foundation, speaking on behalf of the African people who are most faced with these terrible disasters, who are faced on their daily basis with destructions of lives and properties that they have labored to gather, we are speaking and advocating that we need collaborations. Africa and the Southern countries must collaborate to deal with a common enemy. When we collaborate first on our own, then we can begin to look elsewhere in the global North. Let us have a unified collaboration amongst ourselves to see that what affects the eyes affects the mouth. So by the time we begin to collaborate and deal with these issues as family, the common enemy, which is climate crisis, will be dealt with even from its root. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernest. You raised so many points about on the solutions that you think is needed for us to respond to all this. Now, I would like to just move on to also the other speakers, seeing that we are actually running out of time, but we have received many questions from the audience on the chat box. I would like to just kind of lay down a couple of questions and invite all of the speakers to answer them however you see fit, as well as making this last answer sort of like the closing statement, because we are running out of time, and if possible can make it very like in succinct and very effective timing. The first question that I would like to mention is perhaps what actually blocks the developing nations to fulfill its promise. Several discussion already mentioned about, you know, the inability of developed nations to fulfill the $100 billion promise. So what are the challenges and how can we actually ensure that? Because several speakers already mentioned that the promise to be fulfilled is important because it will build trust for further global North-South cooperation on climate. And then secondly, the question is from Frankie Ariadi. From Mia. What will be the first step to ensure the correct course of global stocktake? I think these questions any speakers can respond, as well as I would like to invite you to sort of make this a closing statement. Perhaps I will invite Sandra first.
Thank you so much, Chiara, and thank you again, colleagues. Very quick, I think we are facing different battles. At the international level, we want to see more ambitious developed countries working towards the compliance of the commitments that they already have. And of course, at the same time, we want to have, at the national level, we also want to encourage countries to continue transforming policies and regulations. And I think here is where all as citizens, we have the power to push at the different directions. At the international level, for instance, many developed countries have been arguing, like in terms of the allocation of budget, budgets that are approved by the legislative sector. So I think it is important to start developing further campaigns, further advocacy strategies in the context of the legislative power as well in each of the different countries, developed and developing countries, for more appropriate allocation of financial support at different levels based, as I was saying, in the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, because developed countries have to allocate those resources and have to ensure that those resources arrive where it needs to arrive. And this is not only about increasing the amount of financial climate finance, but it's also increasing the effectiveness. And this is very important. Like, we have to advocate for better climate finance, that it's not only towards mitigation, that, as you know, 80% of the financial support has been going to mitigation, but we have to increase, not only doubling, but increasing at least 10 times more adaptation finance, and of course, loss and damage. And at the national level, of course, we have to deal with, to ensure that more developing countries are also mainstreaming climate change in their operations, to ensure that work across all the different sectors, and of course considering not only climate but the reduction of poverty and the need to also transform our institutions and to mainstream really in all our budgetary system public finance. And I would say that it is very difficult, and the challenge is major, but we need to start also thinking that the solutions are there, and the way out of this crisis is in all of us. We all play a role in this process, building capacities, exchanging experiences, and of course also advocating, making more litigations against companies that are not complying with the rules, and really trying to connect better, not only from the differences that we have as humanity, but also from those common denominators. I truly believe that this is a huge opportunity of all of us as citizens to come together and to fight together, because this is our opportunity. We only have 7 years, and if we come from inside, from the heart, to transform, I think it's going to be a very transformational approach. And of course, I am also an optimist that believes that we can make the big difference, because the solutions are there, and now we need that willingness to contribute and to collaborate among all of us. Thank you, Kira.
Thank you, Sandra. Yes, the solutions are there, and I'm glad that you are an optimist too. Now, I would like to invite Ambassador Melanie. Ambassador Melanie, if you can perhaps give your take on the questions, as well as perhaps the closing remarks for your participation today.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this excellent event today. So on the 100 billion, I think it's really important that we don't allow a narrative that this hasn't been met as the basis for breaking trust, because actually also looking at the glass half full, the fact that it will be met this year, yes, it's a year or two late, but actually, when I first started working on climate finance, the idea of 100 billion being available was something that felt like such a stretch. And in a sense, we're achieving it globally, even if, a year late. So let's remember that achievement is quite a milestone. But of course, the tens of trillions is what we should be focusing on. And on that, I think the most important thing is the reform of the international financial system. Some of the ideas being put forward by Prime Minister Motley. We've just heard in Marrakesh today, the president of the World Bank making commitments that are worth 157 billion over 10 years alone in stretching the balance sheet. Capital increases to the IFIs could make a significant difference in the amount of money and concessional finance that can flow. This is the most efficient way to provide finance into climate. So I think the next steps very much around the IFI reform and the reform of the financial system. And I look forward to us continuing to drive that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Melanie. So the IFI reform and continue increasing funding for those. And so next I would like to invite Professor Ting Fei to also give his answer as well as closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Because I see your question regarding to the fairness and the equity issues. I think is quite challenging, but it is achievable because of that the reason for that is because of there's no common agreement on what is principle for fairness and equity, that people can debate this for many years, but there's no hope to reach achievement. That is why this is challenging. But at the same time, I think that we can achieve this as close as possible through consider this as a holistic approach, which means not only focus on mitigation, but also consider this challenge as a whole, including both mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation, loss, and damage. Because of that, this approach can address the concerns from majority of the countries, and then that will bring us closer to the fairness and equity. And also at the same time, we need a very inclusive process to make sure that everyone's voice is heard, will be considered in the process of negotiation and turns in the process of implementation. I think only through this we can make us much more closer to the fairness and equity. And in this time, I think that we really need this international cooperation. But we see the whole world is slicing towards a so-called decoupling or de-risking. I don't think that is a good trend. We need to consider more integration and more cooperation among us instead of isolation and separation.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to refer to Ernest to give his final thoughts.
All right, thank you very much. Quickly, I want to thank the Foreign Policy of Indonesia, the Climate Unit, for inviting the Africa Youth Growth Foundation to speak and discuss at this Global Town Hall mini-series. I bring you greetings from the Executive Director, Dr. Arome Salifo. For as closing remark, we're adding to the solutions we provided already, that a new financial commitment to climate action in Africa and also in the Global South should be established. And the North and the South must collaborate to ensure the realization of this idea. We also advise that a new global adaptation goal should also be looked into. A just transition plan for Africa that is leaving no one behind will also be considered, and it is key for us. And finally, a strong African presence in the global climate negotiations is key. And by the time all of these are put into consideration, a better and safer world where everybody will have equal rights to participate on issues and problems that affect them and their environment and lives will be created. And finally, I say thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ernest. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody, I think in the last hour we have heard so many ideas, perhaps on not only on the challenges, but also the opportunities that can come arise with all of the challenges that we're dealing with in terms of climate actions. And so I think we heard many initiatives, like as mentioned about the Bridgetown initiatives, loss and damage, the needs to bridge those gaps in financing, but as well as also capacity and on the other sectors. I think that the next COP28, from what we heard, would be very much a very important momentum for us that we need to all together monitor and highlight. And I would also very much encourage that for all of us to always come together and talk, no matter what you're from, north, south, east, west, and also just to encourage that we can all be in this together to tackle the running out of time, because we're running out of time. So that thank you so much for all the discussion, and please stay tuned in our organization and social media so that you can also come to the other Global Town Hall miniseries. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of the speakers here and also the audience for your questions. Thank you, and I'll move this back to the MC.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kiara, for moderating the discussions, and also thank you for all the speakers for sharing your incredible insights. And before we wrap up the event, I would like to invite the speakers and also participants for a short photo session. So everyone, please have your camera on and have your bright smile ready. On my count, 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, another one. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. It has been a fruitful discussion, and I'm sure the audience found the sessions interesting and highly informative. And today's event will be available for rewatch on FPCI official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. You will see in the chat box a link for everyone to fill in, and that the link is for you to claim the e-certificate. So please make sure to fill in details correctly, as the e-certificates will be sent to your email. Once again, thank you everyone for tuning in to today's discussion. You can follow our social media handles for more information about our activities, events, and programs via Instagram at FPC Indo and also at Global Town Hall. Also, do stay tuned to our next Global Town Hall mini-series. See you at the next FPCI events, and have a lovely weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye. Okay.